Okay, Muneeb Ali, GM, welcome.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us. And you and I go way back. We've spoken over the years, and I've kind of watched your crypto journey. We will get into stacks, and we want to kind of hear all about that. But let's start this way. Let's rewind all the way back to, correct me if I'm wrong, 2013 is when you co-founded Blockstack with Ryan Shea. Bring us back to that time. Tell us about what that was and your kind of entryway into crypto. I feel like 2013 marks you as an OG nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Bitcoin was like, under $100 back then. I'll stop buying when it will cross 100 because it will feel too expensive. But that's another story. Rewinding all the way back, I think like 2013. This is, by the way, like Ethereum didn't exist. The second largest blockchain was Namecoin, which is a fork of Bitcoin, right? Or Litecoin, and these types. Litecoin is still around in one shape or the other. And interestingly, I think the way I got introduced with my co-founder was more about, hey, Bitcoin is fascinating. It's an amazing, almost like a money layer, but it's also providing this very interesting decentralized infrastructure. So what else can you do with that infrastructure? So when we were the crypto industry was pretty small. When we would talk to people, we would be talking about like, hey, what type of applications can you build on it, right? So people would sometimes classify us as the non-payments use cases of blockchains, right? And now, if you think about it, those use cases are turning out to be bigger than the actual payments use cases. And interestingly, we're kind of like Bitcoiners. That's how we started, and we were really interested in building things on top of Bitcoin. So that's how we got our hands dirty. Me and Ryan, we were effectively building early versions of Bitcoin apps. Right, so this is like a about.me type of an application built on top of Bitcoin, right? Or we are thinking of expanding it to some sort of a social network application and so on. And the lessons that we learned in the early days, I think they directly translated into the design of Stacks. So the Stacks project, even though we go way back, the Stacks project really came together in 2017, right? So that's where the white paper came out. That's when we did our kind of first token offering, raised some capital to actually build out the network. But the lessons that we learned, trying to build on Bitcoin directly and building different applications and protocols on Bitcoin, they directly translated into the design of Stacks, right? And so that was 2017.
Muneeb, hey, it's Jeff. I'd love to jump in. Thanks for joining us. I always find it fun talking to the real Bitcoin OGs. If you're trying to build apps in 2013, what I'd like to hear is, when did you first discover Bitcoin? Was there sort of a moment that sticks in your mind, or how did you first find it?
So I've actually searched my emails for the first mention of Bitcoin and how did I discover it? Interestingly, this is around 2011. Where Arvind, he's a professor at Princeton. So I was in grad school at Princeton at that time. And Arvind, he's written a book on Bitcoin as well. He's still a professor there. He was just joining and he was doing a reading group and he wanted to read the Bitcoin paper. And I saw it and I was like, yeah, this is definitely interesting. And then a bunch of people pinged me about it. Given knowing me and knowing my interest, a bunch of people were like, why don't you go to this paper reading? I actually didn't go. This is one of those misses, right? I think I wasted 2 years of my life by not actually going there. And I still have that paper in a folder. It's called To Read, right? So imagine sometimes you go back and you're like, only if I would have done this 2 years earlier, but still 2013 wasn't that late. So 2013 was kind of really when we started digging in. And this was mostly the New York, I think, crypto community. So my co-founder was pretty plugged in. And East Village was, looking back, a lot of the crypto companies and founders were hanging out in that very small neighborhood at that time. And we just happened to kind of be there. One of the Ethereum co-founders was renting an apartment on top of me. Chainlink founder Sergey was renting out a desk at our co-working space. It's like Ariana who's now at Andreessen Horowitz. She was living kind of 2 blocks away, and it was a very small type of crypto community in New York, but also in East Village back in the day.
Very cool. What street was that on? I know the East Village well, so where specifically did you hang out?
So I was on 7th Street and First Ave.
Nice. Right by St. Mark's. Well, it's funny because people refer to Union Square, or at least maybe pre-pandemic they did, as like, Crypto Alley, because that's where all of the crypto companies set up their offices. But it sounds like the real action before that was down the street.
And I think these days now we're seeing a bunch of that happening in Williamsburg now. Like Ava Labs is there, Uniswap is there, Consensus is obviously still there, and so on.
Yeah, it's funny. At Decrypt, we recently ran a list of what we think are the top crypto cities, and there's some that would have obviously been there 10 years ago as well, but then there's some newcomers and some rising action. You got Lisbon, you got Miami, but definitely it feels as though San Francisco. It's not necessarily that it's not number one, but a lot of the names and builders have shifted away from Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Let's talk about stacks. Let's get into it. I mentioned that there's been many forms. There was Blockstack, and there was the token sale with the SEC, and now we can just kind of fast forward and it's Stacks, which is simpler branding. How do you explain what Stacks is and does, especially when there's also kind of a long-established narrative you're combating, which is Bitcoin is just for buying and holding Bitcoin, and that's all the Bitcoin blockchain can do?
Yeah, so I think, as I was saying earlier, that 2017 is when the Stacks project was really coming together. A bunch of the early team members were there, and we wrote the first white paper, and then did the first offering to really kind of like fund the early R&D and so on. And typically, if you rewind the clock, a lot of projects were getting funded at that time. Like I think Filecoin did their offering maybe 2 months before us, and then it was us, and a couple of months later it was like Definity and others. So a bunch of projects that got their funding in 2017, 2018, ended up launching their mainnets in, like, I would say 2021 or late 2020 or so, which kind of makes sense, right? It takes you 2 to 3 years to build new blockchains and so on. And in our case, we were actually, in some ways it's as hard as it is to build a blockchain. In some ways it's actually easier to build a new one because you at least control like the entire design and environment of what that blockchain is going to look like. In our case, we were actually fighting a different beast and monster, right? Because we wanted to bring smart contracts to Bitcoin. And you can't change Bitcoin. You can't expect even any small amount of changes to Bitcoin, right? And so our design couldn't be dependent on, hey, we are going to build like all of these features in our smart contract layer. So think of that as a programming layer for Bitcoin, which operates like a blockchain, right? But then we're going to go and try to make these changes to Bitcoin to make our design work, because that part is not going to happen. Like no one is changing Bitcoin. Bitcoin is valuable because it's durable and it doesn't change. So for us, like really cracking that problem, that how do you bring new functionality to Bitcoin without ever changing Bitcoin was the key thing. And that system launched with the mainnet January of last year. So a lot of hard work. Like imagine we had to invent new programming languages, we had to invent new consensus algorithms, and finally I think it was like, okay, it's here now. And you're right that there is this image built up of Bitcoin over the years that Bitcoin is just a store of value. And the reason why people are going and building on Ethereum or now newer blockchains as well is that they have smart contract functionality like really baked in from the start, and it's very easy for developers to do that. In our case, like it's a 2-layer solution, right? So Bitcoin is the money layer, and Stacks is the smart contract layer. And in some ways, like I actually find the separation pretty elegant, right? Because Bitcoin can continue to be money, and no one is trying to change Bitcoin. Whereas, for example, on Ethereum, there's a little bit of a tension between ETH being money or ETH being gas for smart contracts, because those two things, like they tend to impose different types of design requirements. Like to be a money layer, ETH has to be very stable and not change. And it has to be very predictable that, this is exactly what the supply is going to be. We're not going to mess around with the consensus algorithm. It needs to be almost the opposite of like certain things that a smart contract platform needs. It needs to be more agile, right? Like you need to be able to make the changes that the developers are asking for and so on. So there's a little bit of a tension there. So in our design, we want Bitcoin to be the elegant, stable, sound money layer. And then the smart contract layer can keep evolving, right? And keep evolving independent of Bitcoin. So I think last year, one thing that's been very interesting is the developers are buying it, right? They're building all sorts of things. Like if you look at the traction and just the network usage on stacks, like our blockchain is basically running at full capacity, right? Like developers are knocking on our doors to be like, hey, can you actually scale more? We are having scalability discussions right now. But if you still
Muneeb,
look at...
Can I jump in for a sec here? Just for us non-computer scientists out here, my understanding of is one reason Ethereum caught on so much is because Solidity was a kind of every man's programming language. You didn't need to be a veteran, or an elite coder to use it. Whereas the native programming language of Bitcoin is extraordinarily difficult. I can't program it either, so I can't really tell you. But that's like Dan. That's the sort of impression of the narrative I have. And what you've built at Stacks, does it abstract away some of that difficulty, or do you still need to be an elite programmer to use what you're building?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, right? So this is, let's look at it at a spectrum, right? So on one end of the spectrum is Solidity, which is kind of like a fork of JavaScript, which itself, a lot of sophisticated engineers would say JavaScript is one of the worst languages, but we are stuck with it because it's so popular, right? So Solidity is like no offense to anyone, even worse than JavaScript, in terms of its design, but it has the same thing going for itself. It was there first. So much of the industry has already kind of adopted it. So many things are compatible with it. So people are kind of stuck with still using it. And on the extreme end of it, because it's fully Turing complete, that's where some of the limitations come in, and how secure can it be, and we see bugs in contracts and all of that stuff. On the other end of the spectrum, Bitcoin script is extremely limited, right? You can't program much in that, and this is where a lot of Bitcoiners would argue with you, right? They would basically be like, no, you can actually have smart contracts on Bitcoin because there is a scripting language, or they would have some sort of additions to those scripting languages. These things that are, I call them off-chain contracts. They're called DLCs, where a bunch of logic is off-chain, and they're still extremely hard, extremely limited. You can't basically build. A good test would be can you build a Uniswap using these systems? So the answer is clearly no with Bitcoin script and with DLCs and other solutions that in the Bitcoin circles sometimes get portrayed as a smart contract solution. They're not smart contract solutions in terms of what smart contracts mean to a modern developer today. When a modern developer is thinking about smart contracts, he's thinking about languages like Solidity, where you can build anything, or they're thinking about Rust on Solana, where they can build anything. So the approach that we took was we want to be as expressive as possible, so as close to Solidity or Rust as possible, yet having some baked-in safety features, right? So our language, it's called Clarity. It's extremely expressive like Solidity, but it has certain restrictions that make it easy to actually verify code and have less bugs in code and things like that. So that's the language choice that we went with. But we completely understand that it's important to look into bridges to Ethereum or EVM compatibility, because so much of the current industry has already adopted the Solidity and EVM there, and you want those people easy pathways to coming to the Bitcoin side with building Bitcoin smart contracts.
Well, and to play off Jeff's question, does that make it easier for normies to use, or at least people could be hypothetically using apps built on stacks without needing to care, obviously, about the underlying code?
So the users don't care, right? So users don't care what language you used to program your smart contract. Users actually also don't care about the two-layer solution, right? They don't care if you have a separate smart contract layer and a money layer. It's all kind of hidden from that, right? But the developers do care. And in terms of how easy it is, I would say it's kind of at the same level of Solidity. The difference is that because Solidity has been around for a while, people might find more resources available to them if they want to work in Solidity, but that's changing. There's already a book coming out on Clarity. There are already a bunch of developer resources, and the community is picking up.
Yeah, Muneeb, I'd like to follow too with, I remember covering the block size wars in Bitcoin. I remember this is just bitter in 2016. These people hated each other. Expand the blocks, no, keep them the same. And obviously the small blockers won. And I know we now have a bunch of layer 2 solutions and stuff, but if this catches on, like what you're building, is there a chance that we'll see the same sort of congestion on the Bitcoin network and the same horrible high fees as Ethereum's currently suffering?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, right? So this is where some of the early lessons came in, right? So the prehistory of the project, like before 2017, when we were just building applications on top of Bitcoin, I think it became like, until you really do it, until you actually build something and you see it get traction and you see the potential issues, I don't think it sinks into you like how bad things can be, right? So some of the apps that we have built in early 2017, to register a $2 domain name, like imagine it's like a, just like we have .eth domain names, we had them on Bitcoin. To register a $2 domain name, people had to pay like $50 in Bitcoin fees. And at one point we were doing an enormous size of actual total Bitcoin transactions. And the core developer would basically yell at us that, look, we barely have space for doing normal Bitcoin payments transactions, and you guys are flooding the network with these new application use cases, and Bitcoin is completely not designed to do that, right? So I think this is where that really informed the design of stacks, so that we want to design a system where we can have transactions on the programming layer that are just settling on Bitcoin. So they're not resulting in a lot of traffic on Bitcoin directly, right? So we can have like thousands of transactions on the stacks layer. This is how the system works right now. And they automatically, every block, they automatically settle on Bitcoin. It's a little bit like how Lightning is different. Lightning is more like a peer-to-peer system. It's not a blockchain. But Lightning, when you close a Lightning channel, there's only one settlement on Bitcoin. So whatever people are doing, like there are now NFT marketplaces, stable coins, like all sorts of things on stacks, but they're just automatically settling on Bitcoin with very little information actually going to the Bitcoin block.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Lightning, but I'm glad you brought that up. But considering we're talking about, the block size debate, it's a good reference from Jeff, good history there, and all the different ways people feel about Bitcoin. Let's get into kind of the culture inside crypto, right? Which in many ways we talk about maximalists. We talk about Bitcoin maxis. When we spoke with you at Messari Mainnet last September, you said, Muneeb, you're not a Bitcoin maximalist. You think of yourself as a Bitcoin centrist. Talk to us a little bit about that, and then, right now it seems like that push and pull is coming back to the fore, especially with Jack Dorsey and, Jack versus the Web3 folks and Mark Andreessen.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I actually turned that into a tweet storm called, basically, I'm a Bitcoin centrist, and obviously it was triggering for a lot of people. Like, a lot of people love it and they support it. And you can imagine the extreme end of the spectrum. People are really hate you for saying these things as well. So it's always fun. Yeah, I'll send you a link to it. It's quite interesting to see the reaction there. But interestingly, I think what I've noticed is that there are so many Bitcoiners who are not maximalists, right? But for some reason, actually I have a theory for what the reason is, that the maximalist voices started getting very loud in the community, and the way they kind of like actively attack things, nobody wants to deal with that, right? So even if you're a Bitcoiner, you're open to all sorts of other things, and which, by the way, how Bitcoiners used to be for so many years before the maxi narrative really took hold in 2017. It's a little bit like it's annoying for you on a daily basis to trigger these people and then have them yell at you, right? So that's why they're a silent majority, right? They don't proactively fight back or say anything, right? Which is now changing. I think there are many people. For people who are following some of this, like they should go check out what Udi is doing. He's amazing, right? Like he comes deep from the ecosystem and he's just calling everybody out and pointing out logical flaws in their thinking, right? Like and I think in the long run, it's not going to matter. I think the Maximus culture that we see right now is a little bit like the autoimmune system that came into action in 2017 on two regards, right? One was the block size wars, where small blockers versus big blockers, and in trying to justify small blocks, I was on the small block side, right? Like I was like, from a computer science consensus perspective, it does not make sense to basically try to package too much information at the Bitcoin base layer, right? But these people were trying to justify that we don't need big blocks because all these applications are not interesting. You don't want these applications, right? So it turned into a little bit like they're just going to become naysayers. Any new application that comes out, if you notice, their first reaction is that this is garbage, right? Here are the potential problems. You would only see them like tweeting about when something goes wrong in DeFi. What about the fact like how quickly all of this is growing, and the growth of stablecoins, the different financial instruments? Same with NFTs, right? They would only talk about like, it's like, at what point did you become naysayers, right? Like Bitcoiners used to be the people who were attracted to the Bitcoin experiment because they were attracted to innovation. They were attracted to new types of ideas. And Satoshi...
could I just ask quickly, you said earlier, you referred to the silent majority. If I understood right, you mean the silent majority of Bitcoin fans are not hardcore maxis. That's what you're saying, right?
They're not. They're absolutely not.
Okay.
I think if you take a survey, I think there was a survey that came out of Genesis, or I think Grayscale, where they were asking people that if you hold Bitcoin, do you hold other assets? And it was like high 80% of the people, they're saying, yes, I hold Bitcoin, which is my definition of a Bitcoiner. You believe in Bitcoin as a sound money and you hold it, and you hold other assets as well. And most of the Bitcoiners are like that, right? Like when some of the interactions I'm talking about, like these tweet storms, I would get so many private messages from people that, hey, I'm so glad that you're publicly talking about this because this is how I feel. But they
don't want to say it publicly.
They don't want to say it publicly, right? Yeah. Which is changing, which is slowly changing. But if you look at it, like most of the people who own Bitcoin, they also hold other assets. And in a maximalist world, that would not be true. They would only be holding Bitcoin.
Yeah, hang on, Muneeb. Just quick follow-up. I mean, as reporters, Dan and I find all this stuff cool. It's just new technology. It's all kind of neat. So, maybe it's naive. And we're like, why can't we all get along? But what's your advice for dealing with the Bitcoin maxis? Because, frankly, these people are jerks. I just don't think they're helping anyone. What's your advice?
I think my advice
I also don't by the way, I don't understand trying to dismiss everything that has come since. Like the whole crypto ecosystem. I mean, if you say Bitcoin only, you're ignoring all these other interesting things.
Yeah. I think basically what has happened is that imagine almost like, if there's a church, right? And the church has a very simple message. And the church is trying to create in-groups and out-group people. Like here are the people who are kind of like on the right side of history. Very simple thing. Bitcoin is the only kind of like asset that is pure. Everything else out there is garbage. So it gives people like a very simple mental model, right? So that's why you see the following there, because people who cannot like really go and make up their own mind about different projects. It's a very simple black and white type of a world, right? Like if you are on the Bitcoin side, you're right. Everyone else is going to hell, right? So that's the church of Bitcoin. And interestingly, what started happening is I do think like social media platforms like Twitter are to blame for it as well, because they feed on engagement, right? So whenever someone is actually being a jerk online, right, that thing would get a lot of engagement, right? So those voices would actually become, Twitter would like surface that information more and more, and then that person learns. Interestingly, there are now certain people who are actually not hardcore maximalists in real life, but they act like that on Twitter because they know this is how they get engagement. This is how they get the likes. This is how they get engagement and their followers. And they're different people when you talk to them in normal life or in a private DM and so on. So I think what is happening is at some point it became, this is my theory, that at some point it became like the more extreme views you're going to have, the more kind of like people are going to go raw behind it, right? And your status gets elevated. So then it became a game of like who's dunking harder on some of the more innovative things going on in the industry. And then sadly, like some of these accounts are pretty big, right? So they would eat up your Twitter feed, and if they're coming after you, it becomes hard to ignore them, right? So over time, what I've really noticed is that nothing beats actually building stuff and showing traction. like this is at some point what Vitalik did as well. Like, they're the same people who treated him very poorly back then, and they still do, right? But at some point it doesn't matter, right? Like Ethereum is successful. Like it has created so much value. So many developers are kind of like, almost discovering the industry through building smart contracts there and so on. And the best way to handle this is like you push forward and you keep building new stuff, and you ignore them, right? I have this joke that in the end, a lot of these maximalists are going to live on people's block lists, right? Like that's where they're going to hang out.
Well, and never meet your Twitter friends IRL. I mean, because at some of these crypto conferences, I've met the people behind big crypto influencer accounts. You know, many of them are anons, and they have some NFT as their profile picture, and it's like, oh, you're normal and smart. Why are you such a horrible dick online?
Yes, and that's another thing, right? If you go to normal crypto conferences, like sometimes I'm the only person there, right? Or people from the Stacks ecosystem are the only people there, because Bitcoiners really don't even get invited, right? Like, what are they going to talk about? How long can you discuss the monetary policy of Bitcoin when there are only 21 million Bitcoin and they're never going to change, right? So if you go to a normal crypto conference, they're talking about the new stuff that is being built. They're talking about DAOs. If they're talking about DAOs, someone from our community can have a conversation about Bitcoin DAOs. Like, hey, this is how we're enabling Bitcoin DAOs. When someone's talking about NFTs, we can have a conversation about Bitcoin NFTs. These are the new Bitcoin NFTs that just launched, and here's Bitcoin culture that is being represented as it. So we are still relevant, but the maximalists are not relevant. And then they would have kind of like their own conference where it's like raw, and yes, everybody else is not invited, right?
Yeah.
Like
and we pretend DeFi doesn't exist and Ethereum doesn't exist.
Exactly, and then it's a little bit like this is where the logical flaws come in, right? So it's the same people who stand for freedom of speech, like they're freedom maximalists, but they're not going to let any idea that they don't agree with even have airtime, right? Even have a discussion, like even sit down and like, hey, let's discuss. No, I don't want to give you voice. Like, okay, sure, like you guys should hang out with each other and have fun.
Since we're talking about Twitter, I'm curious your take on Twitter's crypto strategy in general, especially, you're kind of a Twitter power user. Obviously, the most recent development is these verified NFT PFPs. And it's especially interesting for you, trying to do NFTs on Stacks, because for now at the outset, Twitter is only supporting NFTs that are on OpenSea and that were minted on Ethereum. But it's not just the NFT stuff, right? I mean, they're experimenting with Bitcoin tipping, but obviously Jack has left the reins there and was the big Bitcoin maxi. So what do you think of how Twitter is approaching Web3 and crypto?
I think Twitter is way ahead of the curve, right? If you compare it to Facebook, imagine like what they did. Like they didn't think about their core products, that how do we embrace Web3 in their core products. They had like this separate thing that didn't really go anywhere, and we are hearing some news that it might be shutting down and whatnot, right? And I think it's a little bit like if you look at Twitter, it's going after like one small feature that a lot of people actually want. Like I wouldn't be surprised if just the NFT crowd actually becomes like one of the largest revenue sources for Twitter Blue, right? And that's a very interesting move, and that's hard data that they can then go back and show to their shareholders and board members and be like, hey, we want to build more stuff around it because this is super interesting. And I do think it becomes a little bit of a bridge to mainstream, where instead of people who love NFTs only hanging out on OpenSea, now you're in a mainstream audience, right? Like you're on Twitter, like there are like tens of millions of people there, and you can actually play around with these things, and they start to become more normal. Like different games will start doing that as well, and I think it really is a major step, I think.
Well, just one more question on Twitter, because I know Dan wants to ask you about NFTs, his passion. But if you were the CEO of Twitter today, what would you do next? What's strategically, where would you take it?
So I think one of the it's a little bit like it's a little bit counterintuitive, but the biggest threat to Twitter, in my view, is the deplatforming stuff. Right? It pops its heads every now and then. People don't take it seriously, right? Until suddenly it becomes serious, right? So the thing that can really, right now, all the crypto community is hanging out on Twitter, and a bunch of other communities are also hanging out on Twitter, but they share similar problems, right? If Twitter can't actively, progressively work towards like some sort of a decentralization strategy, I think then they're creating this open space for somebody else to come in and attack them from that vector. So if I was CEO, I would really worry about that. I know Jack has started certain efforts. There's Twitter Blue and things, but I'm talking about instead of creating like a smaller R&D shop, like at the Twitter corporate level that no, this is a very important thing for us, right? And we need to very seriously look into it.
That's a great point about Twitter. I mean, I still think that it blows my mind just how much we, and that's journalists, but also we, the crypto community, rely on it, use it every day, and yet the user growth has been pretty slow, I think. I mean, slower than you would think. Like, for how good the product is, and again, I'm biased. I mean, I use it constantly every minute of the day. I'm just still surprised that it's so much smaller than things like Facebook. But as Jeff alluded to, Muneeb, since we were talking about the Bitcoin Maxis and how much those folks hate certain things, I want to ask you, why do people hate NFTs so much? It fascinates me to no end. I mean, your theory is that the NFT community will make Twitter Blue a success. I think the same thing. But when that feature was rolled out, you had just as many people, probably more people, or at least, as you said earlier, they were just the loudest voices in the room who were angry and hate NFTs. Like, why? Why do they hate them so much? Why is it so triggering for them?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, right? Like where if you want to cherry pick like examples that really look dumb on paper, you'll be like, hey, this guy bought a monkey for like $300,000, like a picture of a monkey, and I have saved it on my desktop, right? So it's one of those things where I actually thought that the way the NFT community responded with memes and really looking some of these arguments really silly, that okay, you can right click save, but now try selling this or something like that, right? And the response was pretty brilliant. But I think it's one of those things that it's kind of easy to make fun of and dismiss as a toy, right? Whereas it's easy to miss the picture of like how like imagine Bitcoin, as important as it is basically a fungible asset, right? And the category of non-fungible assets is much bigger, because you can define anything. Like right now, it's digital art, but it could be anything. You can tokenize, real estate. You can issue like stock certificates, like very serious type of stuff could also be NFTs, and there will be NFTs down the road. So the infrastructure that people are building to trading these assets, to actually verifying these assets, to build user communities around it. Like what are private clubs, right? Like you get a membership card and it gives you exclusive access to something. That's an NFT, right? And you get that exclusive access both online and offline, right? So you can't make fun of those ideas because those are human behavior that you've observed in real life. And I think those people who are making fun of things, they can't connect the dots clearly, that these things are very much ingrained in how our society works already. And this is just unleashing the power of the internet on top of it, right? Like a power of not just the internet, but an internet that understands property rights, like where you can actually own stuff.
Yeah, Muneeb, I just want to say I really appreciate your kind of open-minded, like friendly, curious approach to crypto things, because so often on Twitter it's the opposite. But so on that note, just to wrap up, I confess in terms of Bitcoin, I see it as a store of value, but you obviously are making a good case there could be much more. So for casual people who want to check out Stacks, like what's an application we can sort of like, kind of a normie can check out to learn more about what Stacks is all about?
I think we've been talking about NFTs. So one would be I think they're in the middle of branding the site, but right now it's only called stxnft.com. So a normal person can go there and actually try to check out some Bitcoin art, right? Like there are like anything that is culturally significant in Bitcoin, like a citadel or Bitcoin pizza or faces of Satoshi and whatnot. Like you can actually find a Bitcoin NFT, because all these NFTs are getting defined on Bitcoin. And right now it's a little bit in early stage. The next step that you'll see will be you could purchase these things just with Bitcoin or Lightning, because Stack supports like straight native swaps from Lightning into NFTs, swaps directly from BTC into NFTs, right? So your Bitcoin actually gets superpower. It's not just for transferring for payments. You can actually do things like lock up your Bitcoin into a smart contract, or do lending or purchase NFTs. So I think to get a preview, I would say just go check out what's there right now. If you're a little bit more on the DeFi side, you could go to Arcadico. So arcadico.finance, and that's a stable coin, right? So imagine like how many Bitcoiners would love to not sell their Bitcoin, but just lock it up to mint a stable coin in a decentralized way, this is literally what you would be able to do with Arcadico. And then there's Alex as well, which is a whole suite of DeFi protocols that people can go and check out. And I think that's where earlier you were asking that how do we change people's minds? We change people's minds by, instead of talking about Bitcoin smart contracts, just bringing them to market and growing them, right? Like when these things are actually growing and tons of people are using it, then the question about are Bitcoin smart contracts possible or not possible, they kind of just fade away, right?